Chromosomes. Little strands of nucleic acids and proteins are the fundamental genetic instructions that tell us who we are at birth. Most people are born with 46 chromosomes, but each year in the United States, about 6,000 people are born with an extra chromosome, making them a person with Down syndrome. If you've ever encountered someone with Down syndrome, you know that they are some of the kindest, most joyful people you will ever meet. They truly have something extra. My name is Lisa Nichols, and I have spent the last 24 years as both the CEO of Technology Partners and as the mother to Allie. Allie has something extra in every sense of the word. I have been blessed to be by her side as she impacts everyone she meets. Through these two important roles as CEO and mother to Allie, I have witnessed countless life lessons that have fundamentally changed the way I look at the world. While you may not have an extra chromosome, every leader has something extra that defines who you are. Join me as I explore the something extra in leaders from all walks of life and discover how that difference in each of them has made a difference in their companies, their families, their communities, and in themselves. On today's show, I had the privilege of sitting down with Kerry Goyette. Kerry is the founder and president of Aperio Consulting Group, as well as a licensed therapist and forensic interviewer. Kerry, thank you so much. Thank you for making the drive today from Columbia to be on the show with us. I'm so excited for our listeners to get to know you, and you're already out there, but there are some maybe in our listening audience that don't know what you do. And I read some of your things recently and was just fascinated by what you're doing. And so that's why I reached out and said, hey, will you come be a guest on the podcast? Because I found it very fascinating, and I know that our listeners will too.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on your podcast today.
Very good. Well, let's just talk a little bit, if you don't mind, just kind of talk a little bit about how you grew up, and then we'll get into some more things.
Yeah, so I grew up in Rolla, Missouri, so small town. My dad was an engineer, and so I definitely got the math science kind of pounded in my brain, and then ended up going to the University of Missouri, studying accounting and statistics, loved statistical analysis, and then decided to switch my major. So my mother actually started struggling with depression, and so I became fascinated with the brain. So I wanted to kind of understand how the brain works. Can you kind of control certain conditions like depression or anxiety? And then also, I started studying performers, and I was just really interested in why certain people could go through some really hard periods in life, go through adversity, and then come out stronger. And they're out speaking to people, or they're out leading organizations. And then other people hit some rough patches and then end up folding or succumbing to depression or anxiety. And so I just became very interested in performance. And so I ended up changing my major, and the rest is history.
Yeah. So what did you change your major to? Because I think this is interesting.
Yeah. So I ended up changing it to social work, and I ended up getting a bachelor's of social work, and then decided to go on and get my master's. And then after I finished my master's degree, I really studied, I kind of took my focus in the psychometric realm. So I started looking at personalities and became a certified behavior analyst. And then also became a certified forensic interviewer. That particular training was actually very intense to go through, but it actually created a sense of systems thinking. I had to look through different lenses, and especially if you're interviewing either victims or perpetrators, you have to, they're really looking for objective evidence and kind of objective answers to certain questions. And so we had to get trained. It was a multidisciplinary team, so we had to get trained by the prosecutor, the MD, the sheriff's department, the police department. And what it made me kind of realize is that everybody has a different perspective, and everybody's looking through a different lens. And so my job as an interviewer was to determine, what is the truth, and how can I ask questions in a way that will hold up in the court of law, and ask questions in a way that the MD it's going to help the MD out. So in organizations, it's really helped me. My clients say that I really kind of see things systemically, and I can see how different things play off of, how HR will, sometimes play off of some of the issues that are going into some of the problems. So it's been really fascinating. And it was one of those trainings where you don't realize it can help you in other areas in life, but it just changed my mindset.
Yeah. What's so interesting about that, you've done a lot of different things, right?
Right.
But each one of those things has really helped you
you've built on each one of those things and is helping you do what you do today, right? It's kind of a preparation journey. And sometimes, I think, especially young people, they may not know, a lot of times they don't know what they want to do, but I think the point is to get moving, and then things can change, can't they? Because you pivoted.
I did, yeah. And I think life is a journey.
Right.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you just have to go out there and you have to experience it, try it, see what you like. And again, it's not, I don't have any regrets about what I did initially. Now I'm doing consulting for organizations. But I just felt like that was a great stepping stone. It gave me a really solid foundation. I mean, I know a lot more about behavior and emotional intelligence and kind of diving into the psychological aspects than most consultants, just because I started out in the clinical world.
Right.
And so it gives me a level of depth that I think, maybe others might not have.
And I think that's really fascinating. So let's talk about what you're doing today, because you're an entrepreneur.
Yes.
And you founded a company named...
I did. Yeah, Aperio Consulting Group.
Yes.
And Aperio is Latin. It means to reveal. So it's all about kind of revealing the full potential. And that's based on the stat that less than 20% of individuals and teams actually realize their full potential. So my kind of goal in life is always, if I can get teams or individuals closer to their full potential, I mean, gosh, amazing, to think about all the problems that we could solve in this world.
Right. And so that's what you're doing today. You're building high-performance cultures, high-performance teams. You say, we believe that work can be both productive and rewarding when the right people are in the right place with the right training and the right leadership. And I absolutely love that. So can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because you kind of have to have all those components working together, do you not?
Right. You do. You do. And I think so often people only focus on maybe one or two of the components, but you really have to have them kind of playing off of each other. So, the right people is really based on, I actually kind of stumbled into that area of my work, but I would work with teams and try to get them performing better. We would get them performing better, and then all of a sudden they would hire, and it would be this huge disruption. And so what I found was they were terrible at hiring the right fit.
Right.
And so I dug into the research again. I kind of go back to, all the lessons my dad taught me in engineering, but okay, so what's the data around that? What's some of the evidence around how the current hiring practices work? And so what I found is somewhere between 14 to 22% success rate in hiring the right people. And then I dug into why is that, looking at the neuroscience, and we make the decision in the first 3 to 5 minutes, and it's made in the emotional centers of our brain. And really what we're asking is, would we want to ride with this person, on a road trip to California?
Sure.
And if the answer is yes, then we spend the rest of the time kind of rationalizing our decision. So I always tell clients, you're better off putting 2 resumes up there and throwing a dart. You'd have a better chance at getting it. And simply, we just tend to hire people that we like.
Right.
And so the people that get favored, now some people, will argue like, well, but you would hate to have like machines decide it for you. And I'm like, well, but it would be more objective. I mean, is it any better to say I'm going to hire somebody that's like me or that I like? Because interviews are shown to favor people that are attractive, people that are extroverted, and people that are manipulative. And
that's interesting.
Right. And so
that's kind of scary.
That's where I see a lot of introverts thrown out of the candidate pool when they really should be in the candidate pool. But again, they don't interview as well. They're quieter. They're more humble.
Right.
And so they're not going to come off as dynamic and, exciting in an interview. And so that was the first place. I noticed there was a disruption. People were hiring and they were hiring a poor fit. And so what we did is we went through and developed a process because I wanted to figure out, can we make it more objective? And so sure enough, you can. I mean, people are people. You can't get 100% match, but you can get the job matching rate from a 14% up to around 80 to 90% if you use a more objective process.
Incredible.
Right.
So what tools are you using? Do you have a proprietary tool that you've developed?
I do. I have a tool that I developed, and then we also use some assessments to evaluate candidates. But the first part of it is really, and again, you can do this on your own. You don't necessarily have to use our exact proprietary process, but you really need to outline the role objectively. And so really looking at what are the top 3 to 5 key accountabilities, what are the priorities, what are the KPIs or critical success factors,
the competencies,
and then what are the competencies, the top competencies that are going to help that person succeed in that role. And if you do that first, just that exercise alone will get you part of the way, because now we've made it more objective. And so now we look at, okay, so what kind of person would that be? Are we looking for a detail-oriented person? Okay, if it's super detail-oriented, is that person more likely to be introverted or extroverted? And so you can start having conversations to try to manage your thinking in the process, because I found that when my clients get into an interview, they fall in love with somebody. And then it's like, it doesn't matter.
It's hard to back up then.
It is.
It's really hard to back up.
And so if you can do that first, I always take them back. Wait a minute, but you said you needed this, that this is what you need. You said this. I didn't say it. You kind of came up with this list, but now you're saying you like this person. So tell me why. And so I really hold people accountable to really matching it to their benchmark. What is it that you said you needed? And are you following that? Because even when you do that, people inherently are like, well, but I think now that I think about it.
Yeah, right.
And so
that is absolutely huge. So doing that, using more the analytical piece, the objective piece, not as much of the subjective, you can get your success rate, you said, from 14% up to 80 or 90%?
Up to 80 or 90. We've at points gotten it up to like 92%. And that's when we're even, if we take it a step further, I've gone into organizations and we've actually done a mini study, and we've looked at their top performers compared to their low performers.
Right.
And we start to tease out what's different. Then we can not just look at sales in general and say what's critical in sales, but we can say, what about sales in your organization? And then the great thing about doing that, we did that for a client in Denver, and what they found was they were having a hard time. It was a sales position, but it was a little bit of a different sales position. So they really had a hard time, number one, finding people that could be successful in that role, and then number two, finding the right people. But once we benchmarked it and then we did a study to kind of tease out what were the differences between their top performers and low performers, we actually were able to open the candidate pool up, because we found that in a sales role, which is kind of unique, both introverts and extroverts could be successful. That's not where it came down to. It came down on some other competency factors, some other traits, and how they approach problem solving.
Right.
But what we did find is the difference then came into the training. The extroverts you could put immediately into a sales role. The introverts needed time to understand the process and how they approach it. So we put them into a more support role for year one, and then they transitioned them to year two. So what the CEO was just so excited about was it opened up his candidate pool. And he had two different paths for different styles. And then it worked. It worked beautifully.
That's fascinating. So that's the right people in the right place.
Right.
Do you see, Kerry, with the organizations that you work with, sometimes they have the right people, but they're just not in the right seat?
Absolutely.
That's more the organizational development of the, hierarchy of the company. I mean, what have you seen there? And how do you... you may have somebody and it's the right person, they've got the values, they've got the, core values of the company, all of those things, but they're just not in the right seat. So what do you do to right the ship then?
It's usually a mismatch. And I think once you dig into the strengths of that individual and what they bring to the team, and again, you can take it a step further and run some psychometric assessment on them. And then you can start to see, okay, where are their strengths? What skills and experience do they have that can translate? And that's where I think companies are going to have to they're going to have to think a little bit more creatively and differently about job matching. Because I think historically it's all been, what experience do you have? But again, if it was that easy, why the 14% success rate? And so it's really not so much about experience, and kind of one of the other conditions that we're kind of walking into is that the talent, we have a severe talent shortage going on with the boomers exiting the workforce. We just have, the birth rate went down after the Industrial Revolution because parents realized that kids were more of an economic liability. And so we just have fewer people entering the workforce. So there's a real kind of grab for talent. We can't get the exact experience and the, exact everything that we want. So we're having to think about things a little bit differently. But what we found is if you can kind of think of like what kind of mindset would you need for that person, then you can start to put them in the right place. So we've had a lot of situations where we've just had an employee mismatch, great for the culture, but just wrong job fit. And when we move them around, people are always surprised, like, oh my gosh, they just flourished. We had even one, it was actually a warehouse employee, warehouse manager. We assessed him and just said, gosh, you'd make a great salesperson. Of course, the CEO was very, no, they have to have a college education. This person doesn't have a college education. And so we finally pushed and got him in there. And sure enough, within 1 year, he was number one in the region. Within 2 years, he was number one in the nation. And so the CEO was like, okay, I stand corrected.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, he didn't have a college education, but man, he had what it took. Not only that, he had the experience of the warehouse. So, you have that kind of really in-depth knowledge of what's going on internally. It really helped him. But yeah, more importantly, he had a great profile.
I love that. I love, the leader had to have a different mindset.
Right.
No, you look at the mindset of the person that's needed,
right.
But then the leader themselves has to change their mindset, right?
Right. It's both. And I've had one company, literally they told me that they've had a position open for 7 years. And I'm like, okay, then we need to think about this differently. So, but it's amazing how headstrong and just how dug in people will get around experience.
Oh, I believe it.
But I will tell you, you're going to have to start thinking a little bit more creatively going forward.
Well, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back with Kerry Goyette. As a business leader, you know that keeping a solid first impression with your potential clients, customers, and talent is vital to reaching your organization's goals. If you haven't optimized your website, or if you don't even have a website, you're missing an opportunity to shape your first impression so that it shows your brand in the best possible light. If you're thinking about revolutionizing your website, let's talk. Our team at Technology Partners is ready to help you reshape your online presence. Go to tpi.co/websites and start your journey today. So, Kerry, we kind of talked about the right people in the right place with the right training and the right leadership. So we didn't really unpack the right leadership. So can you talk a little bit more? How important is it to have the right leadership?
Yeah, it's becoming much more important than it ever has been in the past. So, going back to my comment about, we've got a real talent shortage going on. Used to leaders had to hit their metrics. And so as long as they hit their metrics, they were fine. Now there's kind of an interesting dynamic going on because we have a shortage for talent. On top of that, millennials now comprise more than 50% of the workforce, and they have different needs, different contexts with which they grew up. And the older generation doesn't really understand them. And so we kind of have this interesting trifecta of issues happening. What is coming out of it, and what a lot of researchers are stating, is that now leaders not only have to hit their metrics, but now they have to retain teams, because now we're in a war for talent, and it's a competition. So whoever can win the best talent wins. On top of that, you have to retain a team of millennials, and these are people that we just don't understand.
Right.
And this is an era where they have a choice. So this is, what some researchers will call the era of choice. And so they will not stick with a manager if the manager is toxic, because they have a choice.
Right.
And this is also the first generation that will take a job, leave that job because of the leader, and take another job for less money but better environment.
Is that right?
And
so it's critical.
It's critical.
And we pay attention to those things.
CEOs are now demanding from their leaders, you have got to figure out how to retain them. And so I am seeing leaders, it's over the past 18 months, I have seen a shift. And leaders that have been a leader for 25, 30 years, and sometimes with the same company, they're actually getting fired. I had a leader with 2 degrees from an Ivy League school that got fired. And it was simply because
just could not pivot,
could not retain
the team.
And he was a real jerk, smart, knew everything, but the CEO eventually said he became an economic liability.
Yeah, it's just not going to fly.
That didn't happen before. And so these older leaders that just say, we just know I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep doing things the way I've always done them. I will tell you, you will be kind of sorely behind the 8 ball. The market is, it's just the law of supply and demand. And so the market is demanding that. On top of that, we've got advancements in technology. So there was a really good article written in MIT Sloan magazine, and they were talking about what does AI mean for management. It was a really well done article, and basically the crux of it, they had multiple things, but one of which is it's demanding more emotional intelligence from leaders, because now there's there's judgment around the data that we need. Our brains were not designed to encode information, and so we have to figure out, we have all this data now, what do we do with it? And so that's where I was at a symposium and listening to one of the chief strategy officer at IBM, and that's what he said. That's our number one focus is, they totally get that our brains are not wired to encode data. So how do we we use all this wonderful data that we have to make better decisions. And so anyway, so I just think that even the environment is demanding that we increase our emotional intelligence and increase our leadership capacity.
Well, you've got the perfect segue because I want to talk about emotional intelligence. I find this so fascinating. Different people define it differently, Kerry. How do you define emotional intelligence?
I get asked this a lot. I did a keynote out in Vienna, Austria, and so it's a really hot topic right now. I get asked to speak on it a lot. What I find interesting is when I kind of poll people and say, okay, who thinks we need more emotional intelligence? All the hands go up. But then when I say, okay, so what is it? I mean, we know it's something good.
Right.
We know we probably need more of it.
Right.
But that's one thing I kind of love to do is like, let's take some concepts and really break it down. What's practical about it? And so most people will say it's managing your emotions. Most people will say, you know, it's, oh, well, my interpersonal skills, how do I better relate to other people? And that's part of it. But I think, you know, what's come out in neuroscience that I think is so critical to emotional intelligence, and this is, you know, in my book, I talk about this, but you have to understand, you know, the brain, the way it processes information, you know, I kind of use this analogy, while this is a podcast, I'll kind of walk you through it verbally, but if you just take your hand and you take your thumb and cross it across your palm and then wrap your four fingers around almost like a fist, you can see that your thumb, that's kind of just a crude representation of the human brain, but the thumb represents the limbic system, and that's where all of your emotional processing takes place. The four fingers represent your prefrontal cortex, which sits right behind your skull plate. That's where all of your cognitive analysis, your logical reasoning takes place. And so when we are talking about emotional intelligence, people say we need more of it, but it's kind of an afterthought. If I have time as a leader, if, you know, or, you know, even as an individual contributor, you know, yeah, I want to grow in that, but it's always way down on the list after their technical skills. But I will tell you, as a leader, it is so much more predictive of success. And so the reason is because we think and process information in our prefrontal cortex, but our limbic system, it's unconscious and it's automatic. The brain is really, really pretty efficient and it runs amazingly well. And the reason it does that is because most of the day we're operating from our limbic system. So the prefrontal cortex, this is where we think, but this is where we act. So if where we're acting pretty much over 90% of the day is coming from our emotional centers, well, gosh, then
it's pretty important.
Do I want to be driven
Yes.
by that, or do I want to take control and get in the driver's seat and decide how I want to act? And we've all experienced it. And the limbic system is responsible for the fight or flight. We used to think that was only around physical threats, but now neuroscience has now proven that it's around social threats. And so it's why we see kids these days that are, you know, in middle school and high school struggling with depression and anxiety. You know, a lot of old timers will say, well, I don't get it. Their life is so much better than ours used to be. Yes, physically, but what is much harder? The emotional side. It's the social side. Because if I get called out or bullied and now it's on social media, used to back in the day, was in high school walking down the hall, one person, maybe two or three around them heard it. I go home, it's gone, it's nowhere. But now on social media, it's a much bigger threat. It is a huge threat to the limbic brain. And so the brain will go into fight or flight. And so fight or flight happens all the time in the workplace. We don't realize it, but as leaders, we unintentionally trigger the fight or flight mechanism. And the most common response I see in the workplace around fight is blame shifting. It's not my department, it's somebody else's department. So we find ways to kind of throw the blame on somebody else. And then flight is around freezing. I'm just going to stick my head in the sand. I'm not going to deal with it. Conflict avoidance. I'm going to shut down. And so we all kind of have, you know, maybe different scenarios. We maybe go into fight or flight, you know, either one. But usually based on our personality, it will be one that is more dominant. Either the fight, we're kind of more of an aggressive dominant personality. We're going to always choose the fight. And then flight is going to be for more the introverts that like to avoid conflict, like peace and harmony. And so when we go into fight or flight, that's when we end up not making a decision or not being as emotionally intelligent as we would think we're going to be. And so that's where there's a difference between what I think and what I know to do when I walk in the meeting. But when I walk in that meeting and somebody triggers me, that's when later I'm regretting, like, why did I say that? Can I just put the words back in my mouth? Or why did I freeze? Now I can think of the perfect response, but I froze in the moment.
Yes.
And so when we start to recognize that, we can start to choose, oh, look at that. I just went into fight or flight. Now, what is the response? In order to get the outcome that I want, I have to clearly start to analyze it, because when I analyze myself, I actually put myself back up into the prefrontal cortex, the smart part of our brain. And so when I start to analyze myself, then I'm less emotional about it. And so where we behave is driven through the emotional processing of our brain. And so that's why theoretically we can talk about like what is the emotionally intelligent response, and most people would agree on it. But then the question is, then how come when you get into that situation, you're not executing on it? And it's because your emotional centers have taken over. And so that's why it's so critical, is that if most of our day is operated out of the automatic, unconscious part of our brain that runs like lightning fast, and our brain actually resists using the prefrontal cortex. Most people, and again, if you're very emotionally intelligent, you have about at most 2 hours a day in your prefrontal cortex. And so, again, if I know that and I recognize that my brain is a limited resource, right, I'm going to protect that.
You're in it, right. Well, and there's just so much fascinating statistics around emotional intelligence and why it's important, right? And I'll just read a few of these. 90% of top performers have a level of emotional intelligence. Your emotional quotient is responsible for over half of your job performance. In fact, I think you said it's almost close to 60%.
Right.
People with emotional intelligence, it's proven that they make more money, more income. Right. That's just so fascinating, that, and it is something that we need to pay attention to. So, Kerry, let me ask you, if someone is maybe low in an emotional intelligence, is that something they can move the needle on? Do you believe that they can become more self-aware?
Absolutely. We've done studies and proven it. So you can increase your emotional intelligence. Having said that, I say that with a caveat. It's not just going to magically, appear.
Sure.
It takes intentionality, and you have to work at it.
It's hard work.
It is. And so if you're willing to do the work, then absolutely. We've actually even taken students in the UK, and we've measured them, worked with them for 2 years, and could very easily see that they increase their emotional intelligence. I do a lot of pre and post work with my clients. So when I work with teams, I will actually measure, I go in with psychometrics and measure their collective emotional intelligence. And so I'm tracking and trying to get them to increase and move the needle. And so I look at what's getting in their way. So I always deal with barriers first. What are the obstacles? What are the derailers? Where is this team derailing?
Right.
And then how can we shore that up? Usually it's often around decision making, because our decision making, again, is often through the limbic system. And so they're not making great decisions. And in a business, making good decisions is pretty darn critical.
It is.
And so if we can get their decision making much better, that's kind of the low hanging fruit. So a lot of times we'll start to remove some of the obstacles or where they're derailing. And that's kind of the first order of business. We do a pre and post, and then going back to the statistics, I also ask my clients to track certain metrics, because again, they want to know that it's great if we increase it, but to what end? Well, because we're trying to achieve a goal. And so I have them track it in their business metrics. And so far, 100% of our clients have increased employee engagement, which can be tracked. They will increase productivity. They may decrease expenses, may increase revenue. It kind of depends on what their goals are. They have found that emotional intelligence is a key. And if you think about it, it really is. It's not that it replaces your IQ, but if you think about it as it acts as a multiplier of your IQ.
Oh, I like that. I really like that. I know that you have done some TED Talks, and it's kind of a little bit of an oxymoron, because I know the title of one of your TED Talks is Stop Motivating Your Employees.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't you motivate your employees, Kerry?
Yeah, because I think people are using the wrong type of motivation. Most organizations that I'm seeing are using a lot of carrots and sticks. And so carrots meaning espresso bars and, in the workplace. And I'm not arguing with any of these things. I've got one client that they're doing margarita Wednesdays, beer on Fridays. And again, that is a great indicator of the talent shortage that we're in. We're all competing for it. So we're willing to throw all this stuff. And again, I'm not arguing against that, but I think if it's only that's shallow and it's superficial. And so people are already motivated. And this goes back to motivational sciences. They're already motivated. You can't necessarily motivate them. Now, you can unleash their motivation if you understand what they're motivated by. But I can't make somebody be motivated about the same things I'm motivated for as a leader. If I'm all excited about metrics and love the data, and I throw a spreadsheet up there and I talk about like our financial performance, and I turn around and I look at everybody with glazed eyes going, who cares? It's me me as a leader that needs to shift. I can't make them love the numbers, but what I can do is create a story about the numbers. What is it that my team is motivated by? Each of my individual team members, you should know, where do they get the most joy in their life? And if you just ask them, what are the top 3 things you love about your job and why? It will give you a good indication as to what they're motivated by.
So just because I was going to say, how would you go about that? Just ask the question.
Ask the question.
Right? I mean, and that sometimes we don't ask enough questions.
We don't. And there's assessments for that. If you don't want to ask the questions, that's a quick and easy way to do it. But if you're willing as a leader, and that's always one of the things I work with leaders on, is leaders in general just need to be more curious and ask more questions. And so if we understand what they're motivated by, and then we have the espresso bars and things like that, that's great. But we're also kind of appealing to their inherent intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is shown to be 6 times more effective as far as motivating somebody to a goal.
External motivator.
Right. The carrots and sticks do work. I'm not arguing that they don't work, but they work short term and they won't be long term and sustainable. And so when we're looking for sustained motivation, you have to tap into the intrinsic motivation. And you also have to understand different people are motivated by different things, and that can be hard for leaders. Some people are motivated by opportunities and what we can gain by something. And then other people, which is less known because there are fewer represented in our nation by this type, but they're motivated to guard and protect. And so they're actually motivated by pain. Now, if I try to sell the person that's motivated by protecting on why this is such a great idea, this is awesome, let me tell you about the benefits. If we took our team this direction, this would be, we would have X, Y, and Z. They're not even going to hear it. That's not even going to budge them. But if I switch that and say, okay, if we don't do it, here are the potential consequences. We could lose market share. We may lose talent.
That is going to get their attention.
That gets their attention because they're far more motivated to protect. And that's where, they did this study with soccer teams, and they found that when they told certain soccer players that were motivated more by opportunities, I need you to score 3 goals in a shootout, then they actually perform better. And those that were more motivated to protect, they said, you can lose up to 2 goals. So they knew that they were still protecting the team if they lost 2 goals. And so based on how the coach framed the question, it increased their performance.
Oh, we've got a lot to learn, Kerry.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to learn. So, Kerry, what do you think the something extra is that every leader needs?
I would say increasing emotional intelligence, because again, as I mentioned in my upcoming book, that emotional intelligence is not just, becoming more empathetic or reading other people's emotions or, managing my own emotions. It really is being self-aware about myself and understanding how I'm motivated, what makes me tick, what gets me excited, and also having that same understanding and projecting it out to others and recognizing that they may not be motivated by the same things you are. And so I have to understand them and motivate them by their style, not mine.
Right.
And then taking that one step further. So this is kind of the 3 circles that I cover in emotional intelligence in my book, but is then understanding the environment, what's going on in the environment that is either helping or hindering us. And so if we can really become very self-aware about our own tendencies, our own preferences, and where we may derail, and then really jump into curiosity and get to know our team members better, how they're motivated, what makes them excited and what challenges them, and then understanding what environment is going on, what's at play. We're in a talent, shortage. What else is at play? Is it a strong need for innovation? Are we trying to, increase volume, so we're trying to scale up? What is it that's going on in an environment? And when you can focus on those 3 and have some self-awareness about it, it's amazing to see what leaders can accomplish.
Yeah, well, I cannot wait. You've got something that's coming up, and I want you to tell our listening audience about it, and I can't wait myself to get the final.
Yeah, so I'm excited to announce that I've just finished my first book. It's called The Non-Obvious Guide to Emotional Intelligence. It's part of a larger guide series, the Non-Obvious Guide series, and it's going to be out June 1st, and so it's available right now for pre-orders on Amazon.
Very good. Well, Kerry, thank you again so much for being with us. This has just been a true delight.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Our show today is executive produced by Brian Muncie. Our technical producer is Daniel Williams. Something Extra with Lisa Nichols is a Technology Partners production. Copyright Technology Partners, Inc., 2019. For show notes or to reach out to Lisa, visit tpi.co/podcast. Don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you listen.